You ever notice how the quiet ones never run? The words slipped into the cold night air just as the warehouse door rattled under a heavy push, metal groaning against its frame before giving way with a sharp echo that carried across the empty lot. And for a moment, everything inside went still, like the building itself was holding its breath. Ava Jackson didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even turn fully toward the noise as boots crossed the concrete floor in uneven rhythm. Voices low and confident, the kind that assumed control before earning it. And the overhead fluorescent light flickered once, twice, casting pale stripes across her hands as she slowly set down the clipboard she'd been holding, the paper edges aligning perfectly under her fingers. Outside, the night stretched wide and quiet, but inside, the air shifted, heavier now, filled with usual intent that didn't belong to her space, her rules, her silence. "Looks like we got lucky," one voice muttered, followed by a soft chuckle, the kind that didn't ask permission, only took. Ava finally turned her head just enough for the light to catch the edge of her cheek, her expression unreadable, calm in a way that felt deliberate, like she had measured this moment long before it arrived. The men spread out, their shadows moving across stacked crates and steel shelves, scanning, claiming, deciding what mattered and what didn't. And one of them kicked lightly at a wooden pallet, testing the space like it owed him something. Ava's breath remained steady, slow, almost out of sync with the tension building around her, and when a gloved hand brushed past her shoulder to reach for a nearby box, she simply stepped aside without resistance, her movement smooth, controlled, as if she were making room for something inevitable. Another light flicker, longer this time, stretching the shadows into sharper angles, and somewhere above, a loose fixture hummed faintly, the sound thin but persistent, threading through the silence between voices. "You own this place?" the same voice asked, casual, almost bored, and Ava's eyes lifted slightly, not to meet his gaze, but to trace the reflection of movement in the metal surface. Behind him, her awareness spreading quietly through the room, mapping distances, exits, timing without a single visible sign. "Just passing through," she replied, her tone even, soft enough that it didn't challenge, but steady enough that it didn't yield, and that answer hung there, suspended, not quite fitting the expectation they had already decided for her. Outside, a faint breeze brushed against the building, rattling something loose along the roofline, and inside, the hum of the light grew, just a little louder, as if the space itself was preparing for a shift no one else had noticed yet. One of the men laughed again, louder this time, stepping deeper into the warehouse as if ownership could be claimed by sound alone. But Ava didn't move, her posture unchanged, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, fingers relaxed, ready without appearing so. And for the first time, something in the rhythm of the room felt slightly off, not wrong enough to alarm them, but just enough to exist, quiet, patient, waiting to be understood. The laughter faded into something thinner as the men moved deeper into the warehouse, their voices bouncing off the high metal ceiling and coming back quieter, almost uncertain, as if the space itself was listening. And Ava Jackson tracked every step without turning her head, her eyes catching reflections in glass, in steel, in the faint shimmer of plastic wraps stretched tight around stacked crates labeled in neat black print. Inventory codes aligned, untouched, everything in its place. She had built it that way, not just for order, but for awareness, every aisle measured, every corner accounted for down to the inch, the kind of precision that did not come from running a small business alone, but from something older, something trained into muscle memory long before this building ever belonged to her. One of the men paused near a shelf and ran his fingers across a row of sealed boxes, then glanced back at the others, nodding slightly like he had already decided their value. But Ava noticed the way his shoulders tightened just a fraction when the overhead light flickered again, longer now, casting the room into a brief, uneven dimness, before returning to its steady hum. "Place is bigger than it looks," another voice said, softer this time, less certain, and Derek Cole stepped forward from the center of the group, his boots slower now, more deliberate as he scanned the space with narrowed eyes, not seeing anything wrong, but feeling that something was not aligning the way it should, like a puzzle piece that fit too easily. Ava shifted her weight once, a small movement, controlled, her boots making almost no sound against the concrete, and her gaze lifted slightly, not toward them, but toward the far end of the warehouse where a narrow office window reflected the entire floor back at her in a distorted angle, enough to track positions without being seen doing it. "You run this alone?" Derek asked, his tone casual but edged with curiosity now, and Ava let a breath pass through her lips slowly before answering. "Most days," her voice steady, unhurried, carrying just enough to reach him without rising. And that answer seemed to settle somewhere in his mind without giving him anything solid to hold on to. A loose chain near the loading dock swayed lightly, brushing against metal with a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 and one of the men glanced back toward the sound before shaking it off. But the rhythm did not stop. It continued, subtle, persistent, marking time in a way none of them consciously registered. Ava's fingers flexed once at her sides, then stilled again, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but anchored, and the air in the warehouse seemed to tighten around that stillness, like everything else was moving while she remained fixed, centered. Derek stepped closer now, closing the distance by a few feet, his shadow stretching toward her under the harsh overhead light, and for the first time, he looked directly at her, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the calm in her eyes with the situation he believed he controlled, and something there did not match. Not fear, not defiance, just a steady awareness that felt out of place. "You should have locked this place up tighter," he said, almost as a test, and Ava's gaze shifted just enough to meet his, not fully, just a glance, calm, measured, and she replied, "It is." The words simple, quiet, but they lingered longer than expected, settling into the silence that followed as the light above them flickered once more, slower now, like a warning no one else knew how to read. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, simple, quiet, but heavy in a way none of them could quite explain, and Derek Cole held her gaze for a second too long before letting out a short breath through his nose, like he had decided not to overthink it. Yet something in his posture shifted, just slightly, a subtle recalibration he did not want the others to notice. Behind him, one of the men moved toward the far aisle, his footsteps slower now, less careless, as if the space had quietly demanded a different kind of respect, and the faint hum of the overhead lights deepened, steady but pressing, like a low frequency that settled into the chest. Ava Jackson did not move, but her attention widened, tracking each position, each angle, the distance between shelves, the reflection of movement in the office window now sharper as the light steadied, her breathing even, controlled, the rhythm unchanged despite the shifting energy around her. "Locked," Derek repeated under his breath, almost testing the word, then glanced over his shoulder at his crew, measuring their confidence, their awareness, and finding just a hint of hesitation where there had been none before. A crate shifted somewhere deeper in the warehouse, not enough to fall, just enough to sound, a soft scrape that echoed farther than it should have, and one of the men paused mid-step, turning his head toward the noise, eyes narrowing as if trying to locate something that refused to be seen. Ava's fingers brushed lightly against the seam of her jacket, not reaching for anything, just grounding, anchoring, and her gaze flicked once more toward the reflection, mapping the new positions without a single visible turn of her head. "You hear that?" someone asked, quieter now, and another voice answered too quickly. "It is just the building." But the reassurance did not settle. It hung there, incomplete, like a sentence that did not believe itself. Derek stepped another foot closer, closing the space between him and Ava until the distance felt intentional, like a line drawn that neither of them crossed, and for a moment, the warehouse seemed to shrink around that space, the air tightening, the light sharpening, every small sound amplified. Ava met his eyes fully this time, calm, steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present, and something in that stillness pressed back against the assumption he had walked in with. "You are not worried," he said. Not quite a question, more like an observation he did not want to admit out loud, and Ava tilted her head just a fraction, the movement slow, deliberate, before answering. "About what?" Her voice even, almost curious, and that answer landed differently, not defensive, not dismissive, just real in a way that did not match the situation they thought they controlled. The chain near the loading dock continued its soft rhythm. Tap, 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 but now it sounded louder, closer, as if marking something. None of them had agreed to count, and the overhead light flickered once more, longer than before, stretching the shadows across the floor until they overlapped, crossed, blurred into something harder to separate. Derek's jaw tightened slightly as he glanced around again, not seeing anything new, but feeling the shift settle deeper, the kind that did not announce itself, just grew, quiet and patient. And when he looked back at Ava, there was something else there now, not certainty, not control, but the first small edge of doubt, thin but undeniable, like a crack forming where there had been none. The doubt did not spread all at once. It moved slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor without anyone noticing when it began, and Derek Cole felt it settle in the back of his mind as he took another measured step, his boots no longer echoing with the same careless confidence they had carried seconds ago. Behind him, one of the men reached for a crate and pulled at the edge of the plastic wrap, but the material resisted just enough to make a sharp, unnatural sound that cut through the room, and he stopped, frowning at it like it had responded instead of obeyed. Ava Jackson watched the reflection of that moment in the office window, her eyes steady, tracking not just movement but hesitation, the small delays between action and decision, and she shifted her stance by less than an inch, aligning herself with the narrow gap between two rows of shelving, her body positioned where she could see everything without appearing to look at anything. The overhead light flickered again, longer this time, dimming the far side of the warehouse into a muted gray where shapes blurred and edges softened, and the hum deepened, filling the silence in a way that made it harder to ignore the absence of other sounds. No traffic outside, no distant voices, just the enclosed space and the rhythm of breathing. "This place is off," one of the men said under his breath, not loud enough to challenge, just enough to admit something felt wrong, and another answered quickly, "It is nothing," but his voice lacked weight, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Derek glanced at them, then back at Ava, and for the first time, he did not speak immediately, his eyes narrowing as if he was recalculating something he had already decided, and Ava met that look with the same calm presence, her expression unchanged, her shoulders relaxed, giving him nothing to push against. A faint draft moved through the loading dock, brushing against the loose chain and shifting it just enough to alter its rhythm. The tap, now slightly uneven, unpredictable, and the sound echoed farther than before, bouncing off the high ceiling and returning softer but persistent. Ava's hand lifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, just a small motion as she reached toward the side panel near her, her fingers grazing the edge of a control box mounted against the wall, and she paused there for a fraction of a second, as if considering, then pressed lightly, the movement subtle, almost invisible in the dim light. Nothing dramatic happened, no sudden change, just a slight adjustment, the hum of the lights shifting pitch, the brightness lowering by a degree that made the shadows longer, deeper, and the far corners of the warehouse harder to read. Derek noticed it, not consciously at first, but his posture tightened, his shoulders pulling back just slightly as his eyes scanned the space again, slower now, more deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier ease. "You got a generator in here or something?" It was not really a question, more like an attempt to reassert control through explanation, but Ava only gave a small shake of her head, her voice calm. "Just the building." And the answer mirrored the one his own man had given moments earlier, but this time it landed differently, heavier, like it carried meaning he could not quite reach. Somewhere near the back, a metal tool rolled slowly across the floor, its movement quiet but unmistakable, drawing a few heads in that direction, and for a brief second, their attention shifted away from her, and Ava used that moment not to move, but to settle deeper into stillness, her breathing steady, her awareness sharpened, the space now fully mapped in her mind. Derek looked back at her again, longer, this time, searching for something that explained the unease building around him, but all he found was the same calm, the same quiet control, and it pressed against him in a way he could not name, like standing too close to the edge of something without realizing how far the drop might be. The shift settled deeper into the room, no longer subtle, no longer something that could be brushed aside with a quick explanation, and Derek Cole felt it in the way his crew stopped moving as freely as before. their steps shorter, their voices lower, their confidence no longer filling the space but shrinking to fit inside it. One of them stood near the far aisle, his hand hovering over a crate he had already decided to open. Yet he hesitated, his fingers curling slightly, as if the simple act now required permission he could not name, and the overhead lights dimmed another fraction, not enough to notice at first glance, but enough to make the edges of everything feel less certain. Ava Jackson remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her breathing slow and even, but the stillness around her had taken on weight, like the center of something unseen, and every movement in the warehouse now seemed to orbit that point whether they realized it or not. "Check the back," Derek said finally, his voice firmer than he felt, pushing against the quiet that had begun to press in, and two men moved toward the darker end of the building, their footsteps echoing unevenly, the sound stretching and returning softer, distorted by distance and the high ceiling. Ava's eyes followed them only through reflection, her awareness tracking the shift in positions, the widening gap between them, the way the space itself began to separate the group without resistance. And her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the control panel again, not pressing this time, just resting, as if confirming something already set in motion. The chain near the loading dock fell still for a moment, then tapped once against metal, a single sharp note that carried farther than before, and one of the men near the entrance turned quickly at the sound, his head snapping toward it, his body reacting before his mind caught up. "Did you hear that?" he said, louder now, and this time no one answered immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, as if the room itself had chosen not to respond. Derek exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked back at Ava, searching for a reaction, a sign, anything that would anchor what he was feeling to something he could control, but she only stood there, calm, grounded, her gaze steady, giving him nothing to push against. "You think this is funny," he said, not quite accusing, not quite certain, and Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression softening just enough to suggest curiosity rather than defiance. "I think you came here expecting something simple," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, and the words landed heavier than their tone, settling into the space between them like a truth no one had agreed to acknowledge. A faint sound echoed from the back of the warehouse, not loud, not sharp, just a small shift, a presence of movement that could not be immediately explained, and the two men who had gone deeper paused, their silhouettes barely visible now in the dimmer light, one of them turning as if to call out, then stopping, his voice caught somewhere between confidence and doubt. Ava's breathing remained steady, her shoulders relaxed, but her awareness sharpened further, every detail accounted for, every angle considered, and the warehouse no longer felt like a place being entered, it felt like a space being understood on her terms. Derek took a step back without realizing it, a small adjustment, barely a foot, but enough to break the line he had drawn earlier, and as he did, the balance of the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a scale tipping just enough to change everything without making a sound. The balance did not snap, it settled, slowly, deliberately, like something that had been waiting for the exact moment to shift, and once it did, the entire warehouse seemed to breathe differently, the air thicker, quieter, every small sound now carrying farther than it should. Derek Cole felt it first in the silence from the back, where the two men had gone, no voices returning, no footsteps echoing back, just the absence of movement where there should have been noise, and that absence pressed against his awareness harder than anything he could see. "Call out," he said, not raising his voice, but firm enough to expect an answer, and one of the men near him turned slightly, hesitating before speaking. "Hey." The word traveled down the aisle and disappeared into the dim, swallowed by distance and shadow without reply, and that was when the unease became something else, something that could not be dismissed. Ava Jackson did not react, not visibly, her posture still grounded, her gaze steady, but her attention sharpened further, her awareness now fully engaged, tracking not just positions but the gaps between them, the silence where sound should be, the subtle shifts in breathing that marked hesitation, and her fingers finally pressed lightly against the control panel beside her, a small, deliberate motion, The overhead lights responded with a soft flicker, then steadied at a lower intensity, casting longer shadows that stretched across the floor and overlapped, blending edges until depth became harder to judge, and the far end of the warehouse sank deeper into muted gray. Derek's eyes moved quickly now, scanning, recalculating, trying to piece together what had changed, but nothing visible had, not in a way he could point to, and that made it worse, the uncertainty settling into his chest like weight. "Stay close," he muttered to the man nearest him, his voice lower now, controlled, but lacking the earlier ease, and the man nodded, stepping closer, reducing the space between them without question. Ava's head tilted slightly, almost imperceptible, as she watched their formation tighten, her mind mapping the new distances, the new lines of movement, and she took one small step to the side, just enough to shift her position into the deeper shadow cast by a row of shelving, her presence less defined, harder to read. The chain near the loading dock swayed again, but this time the sound came from a different angle, as if the space itself had changed direction, and one of the men turned sharply, his eyes searching for the source, his confidence now fractured into fragments of attention that no longer aligned. "Something is not right," he said, louder than before, and this time no one corrected him, no one dismissed it, the acknowledgement hanging in the air like a line crossed. Derek exhaled slowly, his jaw set, trying to anchor himself in control, but his gaze kept returning to Ava, to the stillness that had not changed, and the realization began to form, slow and unwelcome, that the calm he had dismissed was not absence, it was presence, controlled, deliberate, and far more certain than anything he had brought with him. Ava's voice came then, quiet, steady, cutting clean through the tension without rising. "You should leave," she said, not as a threat, not as a plea, but as a simple statement, and the words settled into the silence with weight, offering something that felt less like an option and more like the last moment before something irreversible shifted. Derek held her gaze, longer this time, searching for weakness, for doubt, for anything that would restore the balance he believed he had, but all he found was the same calm, the same grounded certainty, and in that moment, the warehouse no longer felt like a place he had entered. It felt like a space he had stepped into without understanding, one that had already decided how this would unfold long before he arrived. The silence that followed her words did not break. It deepened, stretching across the warehouse until even the hum of the lights seemed to fade into the background. And Derek Cole stood there, staring at her, the weight of that simple sentence pressing harder than anything raised or shouted could have. "You should leave," she had said, and it did not sound like fear. It did not sound like negotiation. It sounded like certainty, the kind that did not need to explain itself, and that was what unsettled him the most. Behind him, one of the men shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against the concrete, the sound sharp in the quiet, and he glanced toward the darker aisle again, waiting, expecting someone to step back into view, to laugh it off, to restore the rhythm they had walked in with. But nothing came, just the long stretch of shadow and the sense that the space itself had changed. Derek swallowed once, barely noticeable, then straightened slightly, trying to pull control back into his voice. "You think you can scare us out of here," he said, but the words landed flat, lacking the edge they were meant to carry, and Ava Jackson did not react, not to the challenge, not to the tone. She simply stood there, grounded, present, her gaze steady on him, not pushing, not retreating. The overhead light flickered again, softer now, like a pulse slowing, and in that dimmer glow, the reflections in the office window sharpened just enough to reveal what had been hidden in plain sight. The way the aisles created narrow sight lines, the way movement disappeared between shelves, the way the space itself guided where people could stand and where they could not. Ava took a single step forward, measured, quiet, the sound of her boot barely touching the floor, but the movement shifted everything, subtle but undeniable, like a line being redrawn, and Derek felt it, the change in distance, the recalculation of space, the realization that he was no longer setting the terms. "You walked in here thinking this was empty," she said, her voice calm, even, carrying through the warehouse without effort, "but you never asked why it felt that way." And the words settled into the air with a quiet weight, forcing attention, forcing thought, And for the first time, Derek did not interrupt. He listened. Ava's eyes moved briefly, not turning her head, just a slight shift, and in that reflection behind him, something became clear, not movement, not a figure, but the absence of both. The way certain spaces remained untouched, unentered, as if there had been invisible boundaries all along. And Derek's breath caught for a fraction of a second as the pattern clicked into place. This place is not unguarded, Ava continued, her tone unchanged, but now there was something beneath it, not threat, but truth, steady and undeniable. You just never knew where to look. And the realization landed, not all at once, but in pieces, the lighting, the silence, the separation of his crew, the way the building itself had guided them apart. Without resistance. Behind him, a voice finally broke from the darkness, distant, uncertain, calling out a name, but it did not carry the confidence it once had. It sounded smaller, contained, and Derek did not turn toward it immediately. His focus locked on Ava, on the calm that now made sense in a way it had not before. She was not reacting to them. She had been ahead of them from the moment they stepped inside. Ava took another slow breath, her shoulders steady, her posture unchanged, but now the room felt aligned with her, the angles, the shadows, the silence, all of it moving in quiet coordination, and Derek felt the last piece settle into place, the understanding that this had never been about who entered the warehouse. It had always been about who already controlled it. The realization did not come with noise, it arrived in silence, settling into Derek Cole's chest like a weight he could not shift, and for the first time since he stepped inside, he stopped trying to control the moment and simply stood there, looking at Ava Jackson as if seeing her clearly required letting go of everything he thought he understood. Behind him, the faint voice from the darker aisle called again. Softer now, uncertain, and it echoed back thinner, like the space itself was refusing to carry it fully, and one of the men near the entrance turned halfway toward it, then stopped, caught between moving forward and staying where he felt marginally safer. Ava did not raise her voice, did not step closer, but the distance between them no longer felt like space. It felt like a boundary, one that had always been there, just unseen until now. And when she spoke again, her tone remained calm, steady. But there was a clarity in it that left no room for misunderstanding. You separated yourselves the moment you walked in, she said, her eyes steady on Derek. You followed the light, the noise, the open space, and you never questioned why it led you exactly where you were standing now. And the words landed with quiet precision, each piece connecting to something he had already felt but had not been able to name. Derek's gaze flicked briefly to the side, to the aisles, to the dim corners where movement had slowed and voices had faded, and the pattern became undeniable. The way the building had guided them, not with force, but with suggestion, with subtle cues that had gone unquestioned. You think this place just happened to be arranged like this? Ava continued, her voice even, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. But every shelf, every light, every shadow has a purpose. And she let the words settle, giving them space to be understood rather than rushed past. The overhead light above them flickered once more, then steadied, casting a narrow, focused glow that left the edges of the warehouse darker than before, and Derek noticed how limited his vision had become, how the space he thought he controlled had quietly narrowed around him. One of the men took a cautious step back, his boot scraping lightly, and this time the sound seemed louder, sharper, drawing attention to movement that had once gone unnoticed, and he stopped immediately, as if the noise itself had warned him against continuing. Ava shifted her weight slightly, a controlled, deliberate motion, and for the first time, there was a hint of something deeper beneath her calm, not anger, not fear, but experience, the kind that came from knowing exactly how a situation would unfold long before it reached its conclusion. I gave you a chance to walk out, she said, her voice still low, still steady, but carrying more weight now, because not every mistake needs to end the same way. And the statement hung in the air, not as a threat, but as a line drawn clearly enough that crossing it would no longer be an accident. Derek's jaw tightened as he looked at her again, really looked, and the pieces came together in a way that left no room for doubt. The precision, the control, the awareness, none of it matched the person he had assumed she was when he walked in. Behind him, the distant voice called out one last time, then fell silent, and the absence that followed was louder than anything that had come before. Ava's gaze did not waver, her posture unchanged, but the space around her felt anchored, stable in a way the rest of the warehouse was not. And Derek understood then, fully, that this was no longer about taking something or leaving with it. It was about whether he had the sense to recognize a situation he could not win before it forced him to learn that lesson the hard way. The silence held, not fragile, not uncertain, but complete, like the warehouse itself had reached a decision and was waiting to see who would understand it first. And Derek Cole stood there, the weight of everything settling into place in a way that left no room for denial. His gaze fixed on Ava Jackson, no longer searching for weakness, no longer trying to reclaim control, but recognizing something he had failed to see from the beginning. Behind him, one of the men shifted again, a small movement, cautious now, measured, and another took a slow step backward, the sound of his boots soft but deliberate, no longer careless, no longer claiming space, but giving it back, inch by inch. Ava did not move to stop them, did not step forward, did not raise her voice. She simply stood where she had always been, grounded, steady, her presence unchanged, and that was what made the difference. The fact that nothing about her needed to escalate for the outcome to become clear. Derek exhaled. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening, not out of ease, but out of understanding. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "You set this up," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Ava's eyes held his for a moment before she gave the smallest nod, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the truth he had reached on his own. The overhead light steadied fully now, its hum consistent, the shadows no longer shifting, as if the space had settled back into alignment the moment the conflict inside it resolved, and the far end of the warehouse remained quiet, still, no voices calling out anymore. Just the lingering awareness of how easily things could have gone differently. "We are leaving," Derek said after a long pause, the words deliberate, each one chosen carefully, and he did not look at his crew when he said it. He kept his eyes on Ava, as if the decision needed to be understood between them. First, before it could be carried out, one by one, the men began to move, slow at first, then with more certainty, stepping back the way they had come, no longer spreading out, no longer testing the space, but staying close, contained, their movements quiet, respectful in a way they had not been before. Ava watched them go without turning her head, her awareness following the shift in the room, the way the tension lifted not in a rush, but in layers, peeling back until the air felt lighter again, until the warehouse returned to the calm it had held before they arrived. Derek was the last to move, taking a step back, then another, his gaze lingering for a second longer before he turned toward the open door, the night outside stretching wide and silent. And as he crossed the threshold, the sound of the loose chain near the loading dock stopped completely, the final tap fading into nothing. The door remained open for a moment after they were gone, the cool air drifting inside, brushing lightly against the rows of crates and the stillness that had returned, and Ava finally moved, a single step forward, her hand reaching out to the edge of the door, pausing there for a brief second, as if marking the end of something unseen, then closing it with a quiet, controlled motion. The latch clicked into place, soft but final, and the warehouse stood silent once more, the lights steady, the shadows settled, everything exactly where it belonged, and Ava remained there for a moment, her breathing even, her posture relaxed, before she turned back toward the center of the space. The calm, not something she had regained, but something she had never lost.